One very common and useful animation effect is to change the appearance of elements as the user moves the mouse over them. This can enhance the usability of the page by emphasizing what element the user is about to take action on, making it easier to see all the information in a single row of a large table, or maybe to change an icon to make it easier for the user to select the correct action, and many other uses, including things like popping up some sort of tooltip with information about the element. The core jQuery library has several methods related to mouse movement. The mouse over and mouse out methods let you bind an event handler function to the mouse over and mouse out JavaScript events, or trigger the events on an element. So, as the name suggests, the event fires when the mouse moves over an element, and then mouse out fires when the mouse moves off the element. So you commonly use these two methods together. Then the mouse down and mouse up methods bind to the JavaScript mouse down and mouse up events, or triggers those events. So these events let you handle when the mouse is over an element and the user clicks and releases the mouse button. And then the mouse enter and mouse leave methods binds an event handler to when the mouse enters or leaves an element or triggers those events. So these events differ from mouse over and mouse out in how they handle event bubbling. Mouse over and mouse out trigger the event when the mouse moves over or away from the child elements, as well as the element that the event is bound to. Mouse enter and mouse leave fire the event only when the mouse enters the element it is bound to, not its children. Mouse enter and mouse leave are actually IE events, Internet Explorer events, that the jQuery library makes available to all browsers. Now, jQuery has several other mouse-related methods that give you lots of ways to have the page interact with the user via the mouse. And as you put all these methods to use, you'll find that there are a number of other jQuery methods that you can use to further enhance the mouse methods. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you the simple animations.html sample page. It includes a table of Alaska's largest cities with their populations and the borough in which they're located. A little bit of information about Alaska. Through the use of JavaScript and jQuery, the table has various animations and other features that make it easier for the user to make use of the information. Some of them include, when the user moves the mouse over a row in the body of the table, the row gets a red background and the font is bolded and changes to yellow. When the mouse moves off the row, its appearance is restored to the default. When the user clicks a row, the background color changes to blue, which is a click highlight style. This change persists after the user moves the mouse off the row, so the user can click to select multiple rows. And then the page includes a button that toggles each row's click highlight state, and then another button clears all of the click highlights. And the page also uses jQuery to give the table zebra striping, adding the zebra class to the even rows in the table. So let's take a look at the page and how you can use these methods and events. Here's the simple animations page loaded within Internet Explorer. I've just loaded it, so the user hasn't done anything, moused over anything. So as I move the mouse around, there you can see that as I move over a row, turns red background with the white color text. Move out of that row, and it loses the highlighting. Move into another row, and so forth. All right, I can also go to a row and click on it, and it now has this blue background and yellow foretext. Click on that one, and click on that one, and click on that one. And notice that as I move around, the highlighted rows with the blue background don't turn to the red, but the other rows do. And I can deselect that row, turns to red, and it's back to its default yellow. All right, I can toggle click the highlights. That just alternates which rows are selected. And then I can deselect a couple rows if I want to. And toggle those resulting rows. And then I can also clear the click highlight to restore the table to its pristine state. All right, so that's how the upper portion of the page works. Let's go take a look at the definition of the page. Here's the HTML within the body of the page. As you can see, it's a pretty simple table. It's all wrapped up in a div table element. I have a caption on it for Alaska's largest cities, T-head element for all the headers, T-body. Nothing all that extraordinary. And then here's the definition of those couple buttons. And again, I'll talk about the rest of the code shortly. The page also includes some style elements here, defined within the page. So we have a table, so we have a black color. We format the caption. We apply zebra striping. This is actually done through code that you'll see in just a second, but this is the style that is applied to the rows that are zebra striped. And then here's the hover highlight and the click highlight. So these are the two styles that control the appearance of each row. As you can imagine, the jQuery code is going to use these styles in order to add the class to the elements when the user moves the mouse around or clicks on the individual row. So here the background color is red, foreground color is white, and the font weight becomes bold. When they click them, the background color turns blue, the font turns yellow, and the font weight again turns bold. All right, the page includes two blocks of code, each of which are contained within their own jQuery ready function. This first block of code is for table animations and various effects, and the second is for content animations. And I'm going to talk about those shortly. So in this table section, the first line of code adds the zebra striping to the even rows within the table. And it does that by simply using the even filter and then adding that zebra class. So the next few lines of code add the mouse hover animations to the table. So here it's being applied to TR elements that are descendants of T-body. And it's using the mouse over method in order to define the anonymous function that executes when the user hovers over a row in the table. And all it's going to do is use the this, which is going to have a reference to this row that is causing that mouse over event to occur, and then using the add class method to add that hover highlight. So that turns the background red. Similarly, we need to use the mouse out method to hook into the mouse out event in order to remove the hover highlight when the user moves the mouse away from a row in the table. And just keep in mind that this is going to refer to the element on the page that is causing the event to fire. And in this case, it's the TR element. All right, then the next set of code implements the click highlighting effect. This is the code that highlights a row in the table when the user clicks on it. I did this code a bit differently than the code for highlighting because it takes advantage of the jQuery toggle class method to toggle the highlighting. This method works by adding the specified class if it isn't already on the element. And it's specifically if it isn't on this element, which is the TR element, the row in the table. And it removes the class if it's already on the element. Now, you can certainly write some additional code in order to implement this kind of functionality, testing to see whether or not the class exists on the selected element. But this is very clean, simple code. It's a very nice function that's included within jQuery. All right, then the next few lines of code take care of toggling the click highlighting for all rows in the table. That's that button at the bottom of the form that I used. After I clicked a few of the rows, it toggles each row. If it was already highlighted, it's no longer highlighted. If it wasn't highlighted, it's now highlighted. So for each row, it's going to toggle whether or not the click highlight class is applied to the row. Other than the fact that this code is wiring up the click event method rather than a mouse move method, the selector for the element selects all rows in the table because I want to apply this toggle class action method to all rows. So as you can see, it just takes a single line of code to implement that kind of functionality. And then this last bit of code down here takes care of wiring up the click event function for the click highlight button. And this code just selects all of the rows in the table that have the click highlight class applied to it, and then removes the class. Once again, I could have used just a selector that selects all rows within the table, but this is a little bit more efficient because I'm operating on the presumably small subset of rows within the table that have that class applied to it. And this is following the principle that the selector should select as few elements as possible to get done what you need to do. So as you can see, it takes just a few lines of code, combined with some well-designed CSS styles, to implement some pretty rich functionality for tables. The techniques are usable with most visible page elements, so it's really pretty easy to add appropriate emphasis where it helps the user, and avoid using it where it may annoy the user. You can also animate the appearance and disappearance of content on the page using jQuery. Animating these kinds of actions avoids what can be sudden and jarring changes to the page. The user can see changes fade in and out, which just kind of seems to make the page a little bit gentler. You don't have to worry about making the user sit and wait for something non-essential. Transitions that take a half second to a second are plenty of time without delaying the user. jQuery has both dedicated animation methods for hiding and showing content, as well as methods that perform various actions that can optionally animate the change. For example, the fade in and fade out methods explicitly fade content in and out, while the show and hide methods can optionally animate the changes. So let's go back to that simple animations page and take a look at how you can put these animations to good use. This time we're going to look at this lower section of the simple animations.html page. This part of the page has the opening paragraph of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities as the victim content that I'm going to use in the page and manipulate in various ways. This is the famous, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and so forth. So this is the appearance when it first loads into the browser. And then there's various buttons that take various actions, perform various kinds of animations on the text. So these first two buttons fade the text out and fade it back in. So I'll click on that, fades it out, and fades it back in. Now I have a relatively short duration there, so it doesn't take all that long. But as you can see already, it's a little bit of a softer effect on the page rather than it just suddenly disappearing. This animation works by changing the CSS opacity property of the P element that contains the text over the time period that you specify in the method call. So the element fades out from its current opacity setting down to 0, which makes the element transparent. At the end of fade out, jQuery sets the display property to none so that any elements following it on the page then shift to fill the space that's formerly occupied by that element. And I'll show you how that works shortly. So let's take a look at the code behind those buttons. So here's the button fade out and the button fade in, and it's just using the fade out and fade in methods in order to make the text appear and disappear. And notice that I'm passing in the slow parameter. Now you have different options here. You can specify fast or slow. Fast represents 200 milliseconds. Slow represents 600 milliseconds. They're just text versions of a numeric setting. But you can also specify the duration in milliseconds that you want. So if I wanted this to fade out over 5 seconds, then I could use 5,000 milliseconds and just provide that there as a numeric number rather than as a string parameter to the fade out and fade in methods. That's all it takes to fade out and fade in text. All right, another way to show or hide content is with the toggle method. This is one of the methods that shows or hides content that you can optionally use animation with. And all you need to do to affect animation is to include a duration. So in this case, the effect is not to fade the content out or in, but to simultaneously animate the height, width, and opacity of the content over the duration. So when I click on the button, you can see that the text disappears in quite a different fashion from the first two buttons. Do it again. Notice that the size of the text area is reducing and then expanding. It's just a different kind of effect. The nice thing here is that elements that are below the content shift up or down as the animation proceeds. And best of all, it shows or hides the content depending upon its current state. So this can be a very slick animation in the right scenarios. I can go back over, and here's the code that affects that animation. As you can see, it's extremely simple. Just provide the toggle and provide the duration that you want to use. Also, I didn't mention when I talked about the fade out and fade in, but if you don't supply a parameter here, jQuery will use a duration of 400 milliseconds. So you don't necessarily have to provide a duration for it. The next two buttons here hide and show the content. And these are a couple other methods that you can optionally use animation with. So I can hide it and show it. And as you can see, it's the same effect as the toggle button. It's just that I have to explicitly click each button in turn. If I click the show button again, nothing happens because the content already is there. If I click the hide button again, it doesn't do anything because it's already hidden. Once again, very simple code. There's the hide and show, and you can specify a duration. All right, I'll go ahead and show it. The other thing you can do is execute code when animation completes. So many, if not most, of the animation methods let you define a callback function that executes when the animation is finished. You can pass the function as one of the arguments to the method, but most often, you'll probably just define an anonymous function right within the method invocation. So the sample page demonstrates this capability with the fade out callback and the fade in callback. So these once again use the fade out to fade out the text, but then it uses a callback method in order to report to the user what just happened. When I click on the fade in callback, it then fades it back in, pushes down the element that displays that text, and the text reappears. Once again, fades out, and then moves this back up. Remember that with the fade out and fade in methods, jQuery sets the display to none so that these following elements on the page can move up. And there's various other ways within jQuery to continue to occupy that space. All right, go back over and look at the code. First, I just want to show you how the HTML is defined here. Go all the way through the bottom. And there's that series of buttons and this paragraph. And then here's the div tag that floats up and down based on whether or not this paragraph is visible within the page. All right, go back up to the code. And here are the two sets of code that define those click event functions. So here's the first button. Once again, uses fade out, but it defines this anonymous function that just simply updates the div result element with information about what just happened. So as you can see, it's just like using fade out and fade in, but here I'm using that optional second parameter to define an anonymous function. And that's all you need to do to affect that kind of effect. And then I also include a button clear result. All right, there's one more animation on the page. I'll first go ahead and show the text there. I'll clear the result. And this button implements what I call a complex animation. You're not limited to performing a single animation at a time. What this button does is it fades the content out, fades it in, slides the content out, which sliding is just another kind of animation, slides the content in, fades the content to 10% opacity, which is pretty faint, but it's still visible, and then fades the content back to 100% opacity. So I'll do that. There's fade out, fade in, slide out, slide in, fade the content to 10%, and fade it back into 100%. And as you noticed, between each animation, I put in a delay of about 1 second, and it just provides a little bit of separation between the effects. That is not necessary at all. If you want to string them together in a continuous string of animations, go for it. It just makes it a bit easier to see the unique animations chained together in this sample page. Now, before we look at the code, I want to emphasize that I really don't want to imply that including such complex and really, well, it's kind of ugly, it's just kind of gratuitous animation. To include that kind of animation on a web page I don't want to imply that that's a good idea. It's not. And any website that did this without good reason would cause me to, well, I'd leave the site pretty quickly. But my point here is only that it's possible, and there are certainly some effective uses for this technique. Again, if it enhances the usability or the content of the page in some way. All right, come back over here, and here's the code that implements that. So it's wiring up the click event function of button complex, still operating on that victim paragraph. And all I've done is I've just chained together a slow fade out, a delay of a second, a fade in with a delay of a second, slide toggle, slow, delay 1,000. This is another version of a toggle method that if the text is currently visible, it makes it go away, slides it out. If it is invisible, doesn't show, then it slides it in. And after each of those, I have another 1 second delay. And then use the fade to, which changes the opacity over a duration, right there, and sets it down to 10%. Another delay of a second, and then it fades back to 100%. And I have a little note there. One little problem with Internet Explorer 8 is that it doesn't quite restore this to 1.0 opacity. So just be a little bit careful with that. It's actually working in this version of Internet Explorer. But reportedly that problem is with versions 7 and 8. And I haven't tested it on Internet Explorer 9. All of the animation methods that I've shown you so far, including both animation-specific methods and those that do animation optionally, have been fairly narrowly focused. Although they have a bit of flexibility, mainly to set the animation duration, they each do one type of animation and actually do it pretty darn well. If those methods handle what you need on a page to animate content, they are quick and nearly brain-dead simple to use. The hardest part about using them is probably just learning enough about them to know the right method to use. But when those methods fall short, you can turn to jQuery's general-purpose animation method, which is called animate. All of the other animation methods use the animate method to do their work because it's flexible and customizable. But the flexibility and customizability of the animate method means that you'll usually have some work to do in order to use it. This is both because you're likely to use it for more complex custom animations, as well as because it has more options to set and use. The animate method works by letting you set targets for numeric CSS properties, including top, left, padding, font size, and so on. When you call the method, it starts at the current value of each property, and that's the calculated value, not the original value that the property is set to when you originally load the page, but its current value as it may have been changed in code. It then starts at that value and then transitions to the target values that you specify. So for example, if you have an element on the page with a top set to 5 pixels and left set to 10 pixels, and then specify the values of 50 pixels and 47 pixels for those properties, Animate will move the element from its current location to the new location with a smooth animation that you can customize. You can perform animations simultaneously or chain them together. There is even support for queuing animations, giving you control over how it processes the queue. Now, the animate method has two forms. The first form, the syntax of which I show here, lets you pass a JavaScript object literal with the set of CSS property values that you want to move the element to. Duration property. The duration parameter sets the time period for the animation in milliseconds. And then easing is a way to control the animation, varying its speed as it progresses. And then the complete argument, the final argument there, lets you specify a function to execute when the animation finishes. All right, then the other form of the animate method lets you pass properties and options, and here's that syntax. It again lets you specify the CSS properties that you want to animate, as well as a set of options. The options include the same duration, easing, and complete that's used in the first form, as well as step, queue, and special easing parameters. These last set of options are for advanced uses of the animate method, and I'm not going to cover them here. But you can really implement some very sophisticated animations using this method. In either form of the animate method, the properties argument is the only required parameter. The default property values are in pixels, but you can also use em and % units as well. Some other properties allow other units, but these three are really the most common. You can animate a few non-CSS properties, most notably scroll top and scroll left, as well as custom properties. And one really cool feature is that you can specify relative values to increase or decrease the current property value by, and those use the plus equal and minus equal operators. Now, the animate method does have a few limitations. These aren't really very severe and don't limit the method too much, but they do affect which properties you can animate. The first limitation is that you can only set single numeric CSS properties. And there's just a few kind of rare exceptions. But this means that you can't animate colors or most other non-numeric, non-single numeric properties. The method doesn't support shorthand CSS properties, such as margin and border, which let you specify multiple values for the property. Instead, you have to use the individual, say, margin left, margin right, and related properties. Then multi-word CSS property names, for example, background color and border right, have to be written in camel case when used with the animate method. And that's how I have them shown here. You can't use a dash, you can't use a space between the words within the property name. Now, before we look at an example of using the animate method, I want to caution you that the jQuery UI library and various plugins that are available go well beyond the animation capabilities of the core jQuery library. So before you spend too much time writing really gnarly code in the animate method, do a search to see what else might be available. For example, the UI library has support for animating color properties. The animate method in the core library doesn't let you do that kind of animation. Okay, so let's take a look at using the animate method. The animate method is a complex beast, and in order to completely explore it and look at all of its features and idiosyncrasies, well, it really would be a course or two in itself. But you don't need to spend a year learning it to put it to good use. This animate.html sample page explores a few of its features in order to achieve some basic effects. All of the animations on the page manipulate a block of code right here that is contained within this div animate element. All right, I'll go ahead and load it up in Internet Explorer. And there's the initial appearance of the page when you first load it. By the way, this quote is a quote from the jQuery website. It talks about how wonderful jQuery is. And then various buttons up here perform various kinds of animations. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this page is that unless you explicitly write code to do it differently, the animate function starts the animation at its current state, its current location, its current colors, its current state, rather than some predetermined state. Only the reset button returns the div element to its original pristine state. All right, so all of the buttons animate this yellow block of text in various ways. So I may as well jump right in and see how you can use the animate method to do something pretty garish. So I'll click on that. As you can see, it expands the text and builds up the padding a little bit and so forth. So what this button has done is over a duration of 3 seconds, it takes the block of text from what it was originally shown and transform it into a much larger block. So what it's doing over that 3-second duration is it transitions several properties. It changes the border width from 10 pixels from 1 pixel. It changes the width of the div element to 1,000 pixels from 500. And then it changes the font size to 5 EM from 0.8 EM. And it also increases the padding from 0 pixels to 30 pixels. And once again, it starts the animation from the current calculated values of each of those properties. And that uses that value, whether it's set by a CSS style externally, in the web page, inline, or some previous code that executed. All right, so let's go back over to the source here. And here's the starting appearance of that div element. Background color is yellow, the border is 1 pixel solid red, width is 500 pixels, position is absolute, and it sets the position to top of 100 pixels and left of 10 pixels. All right, so here's the code behind that garish button. It wires up a click event function, grabs a link to that div animate div element, and then uses the animate method and passes in an object literal that sets various properties. Keep in mind once again that these are the values of those properties that the animate method is going to transition the element to. So it's going to set the border width to 10 pixels, the width of the entire element to 1,000 pixels, font size to 5, padding to 30. And then it uses a 3-second duration, which it passes in as the second parameter to that method call. Now, once this animation finishes, the affected element is going to retain that new state until something else causes it to change, such as another animation, code that updates individual CSS properties, an added or removed CSS class on the elements, whatever. There's nothing in the animate method that tells the element to restore itself to its starting state. But you can write code to either animate the element back to its previous state or to reset itself. So if I come back over to the page and click on Reset, notice that that just instantaneously resets it to its original starting parameters. And here's the code behind that reset button. In this case, rather than using the animate method, I'm using the CSS method that just set those properties to empty values. And that's why it just clicks back without any animation. All right, going back over to Internet Explorer. Here's a simple move. This is going to animate movement of that div element to a different location on the page. So its current location, because I reset it, was located at 150 pixels down and 10 pixels left. And that's because that's what was originally set when the page loaded. And it changes it to a top of 300 pixels and left of 300 pixels. So here's the code that causes that movement. Just uses the animate method, specifies the new top and left values, and specifies a duration of 3 seconds. That's all you need to do to animate that text and relocate it to a different location. If I go back over the page and click on Sample Move again, notice that nothing happens. The starting state of the element is at the 300 pixels from the top and 300 pixels from the left, and so there's nothing to do. And so nothing happens. The div just sits in its same location. Okay, you can also chain animations together, and that's what the chained move button does. So I'll go ahead and click on that. It moves down to the left, and then down, almost disappearing, and then very quickly jumps back up to the right. So it's moving that div left and down over 3 seconds, right and down over 2 seconds, and then right and up over 1 second. And if I click on it again, it starts from that location where it's currently located, and then goes through the same series of steps. And here's that code. As you can see, it just chains together multiple calls of the animate method and specifies different top and left and different durations for each of the actions. And these animate methods will occur in sequence. This one first, then that one, then that one. Now, another very easy effect to do with jQuery is to give the user control over where an element moves to. So if I come back over here, notice that I have these 4 directional buttons. So I can move the text down a few pixels, up, to the right, and to the left. Now, the cool trick with this is that rather than moving the element to a specific hard-coded location, as I showed you in the previous animations, these buttons move the element a distance relative to the div's current location. And this uses the plus equal and minus equal operators that I talked about. So if we look at that code, here's how you can affect those buttons. So I have the animate method. I'm going to change the left property and decrement its value by 30 pixels. And I'm going to animate that over 500 milliseconds. For the right button, to move it to the right, I'm going to increment it by 30 pixels. To move it up, I'm going to decrement the top property by 30 pixels. And finally, to move it down, I'm going to add 30 pixels to the top property. Now, you may want to build in some sort of protections, because I can click this up and maybe to the left. Notice that it's starting to cover different buttons. You may want to prevent against that. And I can actually make the element completely disappear. And I can make it reappear. So it'd be easy enough to change the code in order to test to make sure that the smallest value for those elements is not a negative number, so it doesn't move to the top or to the left, and that at least a portion of the div remains visible on the page if the user moves it all the way to the right or to the left. So maybe you would implement some code that would allow it to go as far as that and then stop. Okay? All right, the final animation on the page is also a bit garish, but it shows another example of animating several properties chained together. So when I click on the button, it does this little bouncy bounce thing, and then restores the div to its original state. So the way it's doing this is by expanding the padding on all 4 sides to 60 pixels, and then modifies the padding left, padding top, and padding right and padding bottom together in pairs to bounce the text around from the upper left to the lower right and back a couple of times before, well, restoring sanity and the default padding. Okay, so once again, that's the action. All right, and by the way, I can do this and then bounce things around. Not quite as dramatic, but it's using the starting state of this div element in order to bounce the text around. And then I can reset that. All right, and here's the code that implements that. It looks a little bit convoluted, but it's really just a chained set of animate methods that modify the various CSS properties in order to produce the overall effect. So I have animate. I'm going to first of all set the padding to 60 pixels slowly. Then I'm going to change the padding left, padding top, and then change the padding top, or padding left, padding top, padding right, and padding bottom in order to bounce it down to the lower right, and then bounce it back up to the upper left, and then back down to the lower right, and then change the padding to 0 pixels. And that's all you need to do in order to produce that kind of garish effect.